front of us we have 5 whiskeys from Heaven Hill Distillery. We're going to learn about our whiskeys. We're going to learn about our house style, what we do at Heaven Hill. Everybody makes great whiskey, so what makes our whiskey different, not better, but different than what other people do. And we're also going to see, hear, feel, smell, and taste the history of how bourbon became bourbon, because bourbon didn't start out being bourbon 200 years ago. It was unaged corn whiskey, so that's the first whiskey we're going to taste is unaged corn whiskey, the whiskey that Evan Williams would have been making in 1783. Then we're going to go to aged corn whiskey. We're still not at bourbon in the 1800s, right? We're getting there, but take that same corn whiskey and put it in a barrel, so we're going to taste that and see that evolution. Then we're going to taste how different grains came into the situation and how we use wheat and how that's all started coming in there. And I'm glad to see you've got the bottle of Larceny right there in front of you. I mean, it's not going anywhere. It's right there.
Well,
So
I know, it may go somewhere.
that's good.
I'm gonna put on this again.
And then we're going to see how bourbon really in the category was pretty much a watershed moment for them with the Bottle and Bond Act. And then we're going to see how the bourbon resurgence came back, because bourbon went away for a little bit. So, and we're also gonna, since I'm from Kentucky and I've always been a big fan of bluegrass music and I play a little bluegrass music, I thought it was good to bring up the history alive a little bit with live bluegrass music. So if you indulge me on that, that'll be even better. I mean, it's a tasting, you might as well have fun, right? Good. So, as we look at this, and there's these booklets, and you can take those with you. Then it's got some great information in there, and so take those with you at home. And we also have our website, heavenhilldistillery.com, and on my card is my website as well. So it's not funded by the company; it's just my website, and I put on there whatever I want to put on there. And there's a lot of great information about stuff too, if you want to dive even deeper. But those books are just incredible that are put together. A lot of great information. People want to know things now. Back then, you still have some distilleries that won't tell you the recipe and stuff. I worked at Jim Beam for 7 years almost, and Fred wouldn't tell me the recipe. It's a family recipe, right? And you got to respect that. It's great, but a lot of people want to know, and so we had to convince Parker Beam to be able to tell folks what it is. But he understood, because he was out talking to people, and people would ever say, "What's your recipe? What's your recipe?" So all of our recipes are in there, and a lot of great information is in there too. So. With this tasting, we're gonna go back in our Wayback Machines with Mr. Peabody and Sherman. We're gonna go back to 1778. We're in 1778. We're in northwestern Virginia. We're fighting the British in the Revolutionary War. Lieutenant Colonel George Rogers Clark has his military, and he takes the civilians in the little town there at the falls of the Ohio River. And of course, the British doesn't make it very hard to fight. I mean, they make it pretty easy. They wear bright red. They march in a straight line. They wear tall hats. But if you have a better vantage point, you can even you can catch them more by surprise. And so what they did is they went to this little island in the middle of the Ohio River, and they had to be self-sufficient. So they hunted on the mainland there in Virginia, but they had to grow the native crop, and the native crop grew so well they nicknamed the little island Corn Island. And right there is the genesis of what's going to make our whiskey different. It's 1778, and they nicknamed that little island Corn Island. The island's still there. It's 13 feet below the Ohio River, but because the locks and dam systems have submerged the island. But there's a lot of history there. Corn Island, that's what makes our whiskey different. The whiskeys from the north, from Virginia, from Virginia too, because George Washington made rye whiskey in Virginia, over in eastern Virginia, but mostly Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York. Their whiskeys were made mostly with rye. They had a little bit of corn in it, and of course you have to use barley. Barley is the grain that contains, when you malt it, that contains that enzyme that turns those starches into sugars so that the yeast can feed on it, and then we get beer, right? You got to have beer before you can make whiskey. So they did that. So as we taste and smell this first one, this is Georgia Moon. This is a true corn whiskey. This is not a neutral grain spirit. This is not a vodka. This is corn whiskey. Corn whiskey, the modern laws of corn whiskey state that it must be at least 80% corn, and this is 80% corn. We have 12% malted barley in here, and there's 8% rye, but you're really not going to taste the rye because it's overpowered by all that sweetness from the corn and the barley, right? So it's not been aged. Think of a barrel as a magnifier of flavors. So this is the raw spirit. Now this is, we distill everything at Heaven Hill to 138 proof. This has been watered down to 80 proof, which is the minimum a whiskey can be before it goes in a bottle. in this case, a jar. This is a great old whiskey, but this is the Genesis, you know. We're gonna taste exactly, pretty much exactly what Evan Williams was making in 1783, what Elijah Craig was making in 1789. It wasn't bourbon, it was this. What Jacob Beam was making in 1795, and Hardin Creek was not bourbon, it was this. What Basil Hayden was making was this, right? There was no barrels yet. We weren't shipping anything anywhere. With little towns, you didn't have to ship anything. It's right there. So when we smell this and taste this, what are you smelling? What are you tasting? I heard some people talking about these fancy notes we got here on these pads. Don't pay any attention to those tasting notes. You taste what you taste, not what you read. What do you smell and taste? Yeah, it's very common. We got a lady last night said it smells like tequila too. And I said, yeah, because it's a raw spirit, right? And agave is a sweet plant, but this is sweet corn. So, in the aftertaste is whenever I really start getting the grainy qualities of it. I might not be able to identify that it's corn, but it's corn. It's sweet. It's sweet. So this is a grain. We're tasting that grain.
You said neutral spirit.
Neutral grain spirits. And so when you distill things to a very high proof, the higher you distill a product off the still, the more, the word distill means to strip away. So the more you've stripped away. So if you take something made from corn and distill it to 190 proof, you might not be able to smell a smell. It just be neutral, right? When you taste it, it tastes neutral. So vodka is a neutral grain spirit, right? Everclear would be more like this. Everclear is made 100% corn and distilled to 190 proof, and there it is, right? But this has flavor and smell to it because we've distilled it in a lower proof. So that's the difference between a neutral spirit and this one, which we want to have the character of that grain that's in there. So this is what people are drinking, right?
So color has no influence on taste, or does it?
Good question. Not always, no.
Okay.
Because you can, yeah, not necessarily, good question, but because you can add color to it, like caramel color, which has no flavor. So your brain might go, that might taste like something, but a lot of Canadian whiskey has color in it. Scotch whiskeys have color in it. American blended whiskeys have caramel color added to it, but that adds no flavor. But your brain might go, ooh, that's deep in color.
But these others are going to have other taste, not because of the color, but because of the distilled.
For both, because of both.
Oh, because of both. Okay.
Because usually with darker color comes more flavor.
Yeah, so the color is natural, yeah, so the color.
If it's
is
natural.
derived.
If it's artificial, then no. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, great question though. So as we sip on this and keep sipping on this, I'm gonna play a song about this kind of spirit. This kind of spirit, a lot of people call it moonshine, but it's not. This is not moonshine. We have paid taxes on this. We make it during the daylight, and that's why it's called moonshine, because you're making illegal whiskey. You make it under the shine of the moon, so they can't see the fire, right? So you make it under the shine of the moon. But some people back home call this Mountain Dew. So this is a Grandpa Jones song called That Good Old Mountain Dew. Well, down the road from me, there's a old holler tree, way lay down $1 or $2. Way you go around the bend, come back and there's a jug full of good old Mountain Dew. Well, they call it that good old Mountain Dew, and them that refuse it are few. I'll hush up my mug if you fill up my jug with that good old Mountain Dew. Well, the preacher, he walked by with his head hoisted high, said his wife had come down with the flu. He said that I ought just give him a quart of that good old Mountain Dew. Well, they call it that good old Mountain Dew, and them that refuse it are few. I'll hush up my mug if you fill up my jug with that good old Mountain Dew. Well, cool. That's a Grandpa Jones song, and bluegrass, that's kind of a typical bluegrass song there, and bluegrass music is a very Kentucky thing. Bill Monroe out of Rosine, Kentucky, he called this kind of music bluegrass music, and of course it's not particularly a song. Bluegrass is a style, like jazz is a style. You know, you can hear When the Saints Go Marching In a church, and it's going to sound much different on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, right? It's just Dixieland jazz is much different than that. So you can play any song in the style of bluegrass, but it's just a way of picking it. I'll kind of go over a little bit of that as we go on. But Bill Monroe kind of put his stamp on there. So you know, we're going to bring some of this tasting alive with some of this music. This first whiskey, though, as we've been sipping on this, kind of grows on you a little bit, right? It's pretty good. This is not really something, no. But think about how they drank this 200 years ago. You know, is this something social? Is this something you have your friends over and sip and savor next to a fire? Probably not. You know, you probably start the fire with this, right? But it is high proof alcohol, right? You can do that. You can do many things. You know, it's tough working. You know, you got up when the sun came up, and you went to work. And you worked till the sun went down, right? And you were working the fields, and you know, your body would get sore, so you take a little bracer, take a little shot, right? You might wake up, take a little shot, you know, you might need dessert. If it's high proof alcohol, if you got cuts on you, you can heal it, you know, pour it on you. This is medicine, if you will, you know? So, the reason that they were really doing this, though, and making whiskey and making beer and wine, is that water wasn't very good back there. So it was Benjamin Franklin, one of our founding fathers, who said, in wine there is wisdom, in beer there is freedom, and in water there is bacteria. So you were more likely, just like in the old country of in Europe, and that where most of these people came from. You know, Evan Williams was from Wales. You know, the Beams were from Germany. Boom is their real name, B umlaut O, HM, Boom. Not Beam as we have it today. They're from Germany. A lot of Scotch, Irish, German immigrants came over, and they knew that they were going to have to make wine to make with every meal, because they were, unless you really trusted that water source, you weren't going to drink that water. So they would take the natural fruits from the area, and in our area there was peaches. So peaches were very prevalent. You can have a thriving orchard in just a few years. And those peaches, you know, you eat as many peaches as you can. You make peach cobbler, you may put peaches, and all of a sudden, you know, you've seen the peaches are falling to the ground because you can't eat them fast enough. Well, you don't want those to go bad, so you make a wine out of it. You know? Now, it's not like the wines here total. That's these are only about 2% alcohol. How long is a wine going to last in a jug with a corn cob on top of it? There's 2%. You know, not very long. So if you want those peaches to make it to the next season, or make it to where you can take it and drink it, it was legal for everyone to own a 50-gallon pot still. And if you did that and you put the wine in that pot still, you get brandy. What's called branduine, or what they call it, burnt wine is what that translates to. So they would burn the wine and they would make brandy. And that brandy, that's a high proof. And that's going to last through the winter, to the next crop. Then you're going to take the beer, which you made from grains, and of course in our area, corn, a little bit of rye. You know, they knew they made whiskey from the north. They knew how to make all this stuff. We don't have a whole lot of rye in Kentucky, and didn't back then. But corn became the prevalent grain, so it made more alcohol per gallon. So you got more alcohol, more whiskey yield with this large grain like corn instead of this little grain like rye and barley. So they started using a lot more corn, made more sense. And they were just trying to survive. They weren't going for its flavors and stuff like we are today. And that's how it became this predominantly corn with a little bit of rye, because rye was used mostly as a preventator or keep the bugs off the tall corn. You plant the rye, which is a grass, underneath it, and that keeps the bugs low, most of them. Barley you needed for the conversion. So this is how it happened. As they did that, they made a simple beer from the grains, and that's only 2%. And then if you want the grains to last any longer, you put it in the pot still and you get whiskey. And there you go. That's why we got the whole thing going in the first place, is this whiskey. As the country grows, and folks like Evan Williams and Elijah Craig and Basil Hayden, who brought the first Catholic families through the Cumberland Gap in our area. That's why Bardstown has St. Joe's, the first Catholic diocese west of the Allegheny Mountains, and the first cathedral. Freddie Noe was married there just a few years ago, went to his wedding there. Still there, still a very Catholic area in Bardstown and where we are. And then you had Jacob Beam making whiskey in 1795. This is what they were making. It was only as the city and the country grew that they needed to send the whiskey downstream to the market. And of course, there's not a whole lot of cities around us. So, you know, hell, we're considered one of the country's 1776 declared independence. But when did George Washington take office? First president, remember that? I never did until I started doing this. What year? It wasn't 1776, right? You had to fight the war first.
1786?
Close.
84?
It's on the Elijah Craig bottle. 1789. 1789. He takes office. So it's a long battle, right? So 1776 to 1789. Okay? So it's first time. And so we become the 15th state. But there's nothing but territories underneath us. You know, there's no Georgia. You know, there's the Georgia territory. There's no Alabama. Thank God there's no Mississippi at the time, right? there's no Florida. It's just these territories. And the only places, you know, we had to get to market was on they would call these things Kentucky longboats. There's these big rafts. And it took about 10 months to get from Louisville. Of course, we got our goods from Pennsylvania. So we got our goods from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And of course, Pittsburgh, Three River Stadium, Three Rivers, the Monongahela, the Allegheny, and the Ohio. And it all comes into the Ohio, and there's only one obstruction between Pittsburgh and 981 miles to where it dumps into the Mississippi River to go all the way down to New Orleans, and that's the Falls of the Ohio River, which is where our city was named after the King of France, okay? And who lent us the money, so King Louis. So that's why we were Louisville and not Louisville, right? Because it's spelled Louis, but it's King Louis. And I just say King Louis. I say Louisville, right? And so then we also named a county after the French royal king because we didn't have any money to pay him back, so we just thought we'd just name shit after him. Right? And they were happy with that. Right? So we named it after his last name. Do anybody remember what his last name is? It's Bourbon. Right? So where we have what's making our whiskey different is the corn, and we're going to have a future name for it because it came from Bourbon County. When we put it on these Kentucky longboats, we used the container, which usually there's some sitting around here, but could be one over there covered, but we use the barrel. Because the barrel, everything was shipped in barrels. So we get everything shipped in barrels from up north in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And so Evan Williams would go to the general store in Louisville, and he would buy a barrel from Thomas Broadhead, who owned the store. And, you know, Thomas was just going to put pickles in it, something, or you know, whatever, or get rid of it or sell it, but it was an asset. So he said, well, I'll buy it from you. And so that's what he would, but you know, because it had different preservatives, because the things that were shipped in these barrels didn't have refrigeration. So you put either salt or vinegar or brine in it to keep it. Well, you didn't want to put your good whiskey into that barrel until you did something to it, cleaned it out. So they burned it, right? And so there's where it starts becoming, the magic starts happening. It just wasn't because they were trying to make the whiskey taste better, it's because they wanted to use the damn barrel, right? And so they put the whiskey in there, and as it made the 10-month trip down, here's the first evolution. Going from unaged corn whiskey to the bourbon we know today. That's top right of your tasting map. This would be mellow corn. You notice this is a light straw color. This is not a deep amber color. This whiskey and the whiskey in the middle underneath, which is Evan Williams Bottle and Bond, they've both been aged the same amount of time, 4 years. They both are 100 proof in the bottle. They're damn near the same recipe. This is 80% corn and Evan Williams is 78% corn. So the only big difference is the container it was aged in. And this is still aged in a used barrel like we did 200 years ago. So that's the difference between corn whiskey and bourbon whiskey. Bourbon whiskey has to be aged in a brand new charred oak barrel. Corn whiskey must, by law, be aged in a used charred barrel. You can also use a brand new uncharred barrel. Now the reason for this is not anything simpler than science. if you put a distillate made from corn into a brand new charred oak container, the corn flavor becomes neutral and only the sweetness remains. And you'll have rye whiskey or bourbon whiskey, right? But if you age it in a used charred barrel or a brand new uncharred barrel, the corn flavor remains and you have corn whiskey.
Does it matter what it was used for originally?
It just says used. So these are laws. They're to be interpreted the way you want to interpret them, or a lawyer can interpret them. Now today we use a once used Evan Williams barrel because we have a lot of those. We dump 1,300 of them a day. So we'll just use a few hundred for these, right, for this. So back then they were just using everything. So that is a difference. So this is stream. To me, this is one of my favorite whiskeys. These two whiskeys, the first two are some of my favorite. Because you can't talk about bourbon until you talk about these first two, right? You can't talk about bourbon until you talk about the Genesis. Then this is the leap. This is the catfish that crawls out of the lake and crawls around on the ground. This is the missing link, right? Because this started telling people, hey, this tastes pretty good, right?
But this
So,
was still just distilled at 130 some.
138 proof. Everything we do is 138 proof. Back then it was probably right around then. Could have been a little lower. Could have been a little higher, but it's probably around them. It's probably a little bit lower. Then they put it in this barrel. They got it down there, and they got it out of the barrel because they can't see it. They go, what's this? Man, this looks different. This isn't just whiskey. Right? So they tasted it. Well, it's the same exact corn whiskey we just tasted, but it's been in that barrel now. Not for 10 months. This is 4 years. But it did taste a little bit different. And you're getting those hints of vanilla, honey, and caramel, because that's what a barrel brings, but not a ton of it, right? This is just light. This is very sweet. This is all front of my palate, like the last one. There's 8% rye in here, but I'm not tasting any spice. Because again, it's overpowered by the 92% sweet. And that 8% spice has not been magnified by a new barrel.
Can you talk a little bit about the palate?
Mhm.
Because I'm not terribly knowledgeable about what parts of the tongue would be activated.
Sure, but the front of your palate tastes sweet. So that's where you're gonna taste the sweetness from the corn and the barley and some of the vanilla, honey, and caramel candy kind of a candy notes too, or being sweet. And then the back of your palate is where you taste what they call bitter. So that's where you're gonna taste some of that caraway seed, that spice from the rye. But I'm not really tasting anything in the back of my palate. To me, it's all forward. So it'll become evident when we taste the Evan Williams. So you can go back and forth and tell. And then what does the sides taste? Is that salt? Is that salty? Salt? What is the sides taste of your palate? I think it's salt. Yeah. That's really, for us, it's the front and the back.
And the used barrel is just, all they do is char it, like they burn it. That's a cleansing process, right? To get rid of the other flavors.
Well, actually, we don't do anything to it.
Oh.
So it had been charred and used once as bourbon, and then we dump it and immediately fill it with this corn whiskey. So we don't do anything to it. Now, sometimes in Scotland and Ireland, they will refire them and that kind of stuff, but that's only after we've used them for many years. But we don't, because if we recharred it, it wouldn't be corn whiskey. We can't rechar it. That's in the laws. We can't do that. And because,
So it can't be like recently charred?
no,
So it's
it could be
charred
used.
and then used, and
Yeah.
then you put your...
It doesn't say how long bourbon has to be aged, so it can be aged for a day or 15 minutes, but you're gonna get more of an effect. Of course, we're gonna age it for years, because it wouldn't pay. Barrels are $170 a piece. That's why we're not using a brand new uncharred barrel, because we're gonna do something with it first. So we're gonna get a second hit out of it. And then we get to sell it to Scotland and Ireland and tequila.
How many times can the barrels be reused?
In Scotland, I think they use them 60, 70, 80 years.
Same barrel?
What about,
Yeah.
what about,
The longest we age anything is, we just had a Heaven Hill 27 year, and we have our Elijah Craig 23 year. So that's, for us, that's
but once you use it,
we sell it. Yeah, we sell them. It's an asset. We got known what are used for it. We will age this mellow corn in a once used Evan Williams barrel, but that's a 5-year barrel. Evan Williams is a 5-year product, the black label extra aged. So that's what we have a lot of those. So that's why we can use those.
The rum makers like these barrels too.
They do.
There's a,
They do. Now, we sell them to a middleman, because we don't have time. We don't, because they'll separate them by year or brand, and sell them, say, this is an Elijah Craig barrel, and we don't name them by brand, we do them by age, so we don't put brands on our barrels. But we don't have time to screw with that. Like, you're gonna give us money, we need that, we want that money now, right?
There's a barrel broker somewhere. There's some guy,
Yeah.
he's a,
Speyside.
what's it called?
Speyside, they're out of Columbus, Ohio.
Really?
And they make brand new barrels too. They're really good, you know. There's a couple barrel brokers, yeah. Because, you know, there's people who want to buy old Pappy barrels.
Yeah, sure.
You know, so they think that, you know, that has a cachet for their brand, that's fine. It's fine with us, but we don't have time to screw around with it. Mr. Samuel sells all our barrels. I
So
said,
so like, Pappy Barrel, would that like sell for
could
higher
sell
price?
from a higher price, but, you know, Buffalo Trace isn't gonna screw with that. They're gonna let the middleman screw with that, because the middleman's gonna pay them money now. Because they're gonna have 1,000 more coming tomorrow. And we got 1,300 barrels we dump every day.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's just a lot. It starts racking up, and then you gotta pay somebody to manage the barrels and separate them. I don't know, you all do that. Which is good, it creates a little industry for
You just
people.
want to put them on a truck and get them.
We just need to get them out, because we got 1,300 coming tomorrow, right? And 13 brand new barrels coming in. It's a pretty cool deal. So, they looked on the ends of these barrels down in New Orleans, and as it was coming out, this beautiful color, and this different color, and this different flavor, they said, well, this just can't be whiskey, right? So they looked at the end of the barrel, and it said with the con, you know, because the barrel's not clear, you can't see in it, so you gotta paint on it or put on it the contents, which was whiskey, and then the port was always named. So you would name the port of origin, which was Old Bourbon, Kentucky, and all of a sudden it started to get, you know, this isn't just whiskey, this is Old Bourbon, Kentucky whiskey. Right? Or this is whiskey from Old Bourbon, Kentucky, you know, whatever. It took decades for this name to stick. It didn't just happen one day. They didn't have Facebook, you know. So it took a while. So, but then it started getting a name and a reputation. And Kentucky had that reputation. Of course, we have really good water because we got the limestone shelf that sits underneath us. That's why most of the distilleries stayed there in that area instead of going into way up in Ohio, or that's where you find Jack Daniels and most of our distilleries are around that, you know, Indiana limestone, Kentucky limestone shelf that goes down into Tennessee, because, you know, we have
You think
Mammoth
the water's a
Cave.
big part of Kentucky bourbon?
What's that?
The water?
Absolutely.
Kentucky
It was more back then than it is today. It's 2018, you can fix water.
Yeah,
But they couldn't back then,
There's
so
no-
this is what was a big deal for them to stay.
Yeah, like New York water, supposedly that's the secret of good New York, good pizza. Supposedly.
Absolutely. You know, there's a reason, and also the water was important for us with the horse industry, because we have a lot of calcium in our water, and calcium makes strong bones. And if you're a horse with a little bitty ankle, you need those strong bones, and that's why the thoroughbred industry thrives, because they would also take those horses down in New Orleans, and they had to have horses staged down there to ride back to Kentucky, because once the boat's down in New Orleans, you're not taking the boat back up, right? There's no motor on it. You can't take the boat on the ocean, so they just sold the boat. So you have this Irish Hill neighborhood in New Orleans, and it was built by a lot of the wood from the Kentucky boats that are down there. Also, you know, it ended up, you know, so you sold everything, and then you had horses at a stable that you staged down there. You know, you brought down on your thing, and you had to ride them back. So they had to be good horses, and that's why the horse industry thrives in Kentucky as well. So as we sip on this, if you got any of this mellow corn left, so that's a whiskey we could have been tasting in 1815. And this is a song we could have heard in 1815. It's about making corn whiskey, which we're sipping on. There's a line in it that says, my daddy made corn whiskey, my granddaddy did too, and we ain't paid no whiskey tax since 1792. And that's the year we became the 15th state. So get your copper kettle, get your copper coil, oh, fill it with new made corn mash, and never will you toil as you lay there by the juniper while the moon shines bright, watching the jugs a filling in the pale moonlight. My daddy, he made corn whiskey, my granddaddy did too. Oh, we ain't paid no whiskey tax since 1792. As you lay there by the juniper while the moon shines bright, ash and oak. Oh, don't use no green or rotten wood, 'cause they'll get you by the smoke. As you lay there by the juniper, while the moon shines bright, watching them jugs a building in the pale moonlight, in the pale moonlight. It's kind of fun sipping whiskey from us 200 years ago, with a song we could have heard 200 years ago. You know, I think it's kind of neat.
Feels like we're back then.
What's that?
Feels like we've gone back then.
It does. So we're on to something kind of cool. You know, we got people talking about us. You know, they're kind of ordering it with Kentucky bourbon. There's another story of how that came, and maybe it was the people on Bourbon Street who had this whiskey. And they're visiting, and they take decades later, the steamboat comes around, and they get them on the steamboat, and they go, give me some of that whiskey like I had on Bourbon Street from Kentucky, you know. Whatever it did, it stuck. And but the river was a big part of it. The water that came to us, the water back then with the rafts was kind of like our aging warehouse, right? We didn't have warehouses back then. They started building them probably sometime in the 1800s. But the water was our aging in the raft. Also, different grains started being used, because you can use any grain with the bourbon. There weren't any laws back then. You know, we have laws today, and there were no laws. You can do whatever you want. So if it's the winter time and you need to make bread, you only have some of the grain you had from the summertime. That's in the silos and that. But if you're running low on corn, you still need to make bread. You still need to make beer. So the other big grain in the wintertime in Kentucky is wheat. And so wheat is a nice soft winter grain, red winter wheat. The only reason we grow wheat in Kentucky today is because of bourbon. We got a few bourbons that use wheat in the recipe. And so that becomes a tradition. And it was just merely because we needed some grain to put in there. What wheat does is it adds no flavor. So wheat adds no flavor. Wheat has no flavor, right? Wheat is the vodka of bread. It really doesn't taste like anything, right? So think about it. Corn bread, I'm not just bringing cornbread to people in Texas, right? I do in New York, but cornbread is it's almost like a cake, right? It's very flavorful. It has all the flavor. You don't make a sandwich with cornbread. It stands on its own, right? So it's that flavorful. So think about that with bourbon. That's what we're using as the base of our spirit, right? So we got a good thing going. Then if you're gonna make a ham sandwich, we go ham on rye, right? Because rye adds a flavor to that sandwich. It's actually part of the sandwich. It adds flavor. It's that spiciness of that caraway that adds that flavor. Now think of a really flavorful aged ham, like a country ham. Right? Well, you don't want to cover that up with rye, so you might use wheat, because then it's just a delivery system, so you don't look like a pig just eating the ham, because we really want to just taste the ham. So that's why you use wheat on that kind of a sandwich, and that's why we're using wheat here, because it really doesn't add flavor, but it allows the sweetness of the corn and the barley to come through. So when you taste this Larceny bourbon,
Larceny?
this is Larceny, bottom left of your tasting map. This Larceny bourbon, in front of this couple here, has the Larceny bottle up there. Okay, this is made with 68% corn, 20% wheat, and 12% malted barley. So think about that. That is 51%, not much flavor, but 49% sweet. So we're gonna taste sweet. This is gonna be sweet. That wheat does lend a little bit of softness to it. Okay? So it's gonna be a softer, sweeter flavor than a traditional rye bourbon. So when we smell this and taste this, now this has been aged in a brand new charred barrel. This is a true bourbon, and we have to follow the law. Back then, in the 1850s, 1860s, you could use whatever barrel you wanted. They were probably using a combination of new barrels and used barrels, because again, they're hard to come by and they're expensive. So they can use them over and over. They might have recharged these, because they did get letters back saying, hey, this barrel's doing something. So please keep using the barrels. The letters would say it makes a much superior whiskey. So we're gonna do what our customers say. But this is a bourbon as we would know it today, but with the wheat, not like the bourbons that 90% of the market is. This is only 10% of the whiskey, of the bourbon whiskey world is a wheat bourbon. So you feel that, and it's in the front of your palate again, not in the back of your palate. So the next whiskey, you're gonna feel that difference. There's only a handful of wheated bourbons out there. Can you name them? Here's one of them.
Weller,
Weller, W.O. Weller is a wheated bourbon.
Makers,
Maker's Mark, the #1 selling wheat bourbon. Bernheim is a wheat whiskey, yes, but it has a majority grain of that's the 51%. We're running out, right? We're running out. So then we Pappy Van Winkle is a wheated,
yeah.
and then you've got Rebel Yell, and then you got a few craft distillers making it. But the only two you can get every day is pretty much Makers and Larceny. So if you like that, you only have a couple choices, and this is one of them. This should be in your rotation. I like the reason we're all sitting here, and the reason you come to listen to Eddie Russell when he comes, and the reason you come to see Wes Henderson or whoever else from other companies is you want to try a lot of them. You don't just have one Cabernet Sauvignon. You like a lot. I always say the life sentence of drinking is over. I grew up in a beer family, in bourbon family. My dad worked at a brewery. My grandfather was one of the founders of a brewery in Louisville, Kentucky, called Fall City Brewing Company. And but I like pilsners, so I went over to Prague and Croatia and Slovakia. And they make great pilsner bitters over there. They're just wonderful. And so I like pilsners. So I would say that people who drink Miller Lite don't drink it because it's a pilsner. People who drink Miller Lite don't even know what a pilsner is, right? They drink Miller Lite because it tastes like Miller Lite. They know what that tastes like, right? They don't know why, right? And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But if you're, this craft beer movement, you want to taste a local pilsner. I know what a pilsner is, right? I know what a pilsner is supposed to taste like, and I want to taste all of them. So people who like Maker's Mark, people who like Weller, people who like that are going to enjoy this. Yes. So as the country continues to grow, it's no longer the river that's getting our bourbon to market, because the country's growing out west. So we need the railroads. So the railroads come in. The L&N Railroad comes in about 1849. Louisville Nashville Railroad. The old reliable, they call it. Out here in the west, we wouldn't have anything out here if it wasn't for the early times. It wasn't for the railroads. David Beam moves the Beam Distillery next to the railroad track so that he could get the products out here. So this song talks about the railroad. Riding on that new river train, riding on that new river train, that same old train brought me here's gonna carry me back home again. Darling, you can't love too. Darling, you can't love too. You can't love too. Little heart be true. Oh, darling, you can't love too. Darling, you can't love three. Darling, you can't love three. You can't love three. Still love me. Oh, darling, you can't love three. Riding on that new river train, riding on that new river train, that same old train brought me here's gonna carry me back home again. That same old train brought me here's gonna carry me Remember Andy Griffith playing that one? He would play that. That's one of the songs he was singing on Andy Griffith there. It's a great old song. That's one of those songs. Nobody knows who wrote it, right? It's just a little songs passed down. But as the country's moving west, there's a lot of these people building railroads and locks and dams and the cavalry, and these are dirty, crappy, dangerous jobs. If you're gonna be in the cavalry in 1870, you remember Dances with Wolves and that? The guy kills himself because he went crazy and all this stuff. This is a tough time. So why would you sign up for that? Well, like everything else, jobs take care of everyday problems, So first of all, the incentive is money, right? So you're gonna pay it, okay, so that's, okay, I'll start thinking about it, but still dirty, crappy, dangerous, I ain't gonna do it. Well, most people would have to go rent a room at a boarding house. Very few people could own land, right, and build a house. Most people lived in a room, in a boarding house somewhere. They didn't really have an address. They would change a lot, right? You were more likely to get your mail delivered at a saloon because you were going to be there, right? You might not be at the same house every month, right? So, hell, we'll build you. We got a barracks. You got a sheriff. There are people. There's one less problem. It's kind of like that movie Forrest Gump. Where when he gets the check from Apple with a little fruit company that Lieutenant Dan invested in, and he says, so now it's one less thing to worry about. You're not worried about money, right? So you got, so that's what they did. They just took care of one little less thing. So you got one less thing to worry about. You got money and a place to live. Well, I got to eat. Most people have to go out and hunt. Or have to buy them. Oh, we'll feed you. Oh, one less thing to worry about. What about clothes? I gotta wear clothes. Well, we'll give you a uniform. Well, shit, there's one less thing to worry about. Well, it's still dangerous. People are gonna be shooting at me and stuff. How about a daily ration of whiskey? Well, I'm in. Right? So this is what whiskey was used for a lot of times, was this incentive. And when you built the Erie Canal, they gave each man a quart of whiskey a day. Now you think they were drinking a quart a day? If they were my relatives, maybe. But you could take that quart and you could trade it. And you could trade it like money. So that's one reason why they gave people incentives like that, right? You've traded whiskey before, right? It works, right? So that's, anytime there's an incentive for a company to supply these contracts to the government or whatever else, what probably happens and did happen? You can imagine, we got the contract, now what happens? Well, let's make more money on this whiskey. Let's make it a little cheaper, right? So that's what they started doing. And that's what started really changing things because there weren't any laws. So they were making what they would call compound whiskey. They would just make whiskey that was basically vodka. And they just added colors and flavors. So they would add colors that probably would add flavor to it. So they would add colors like iodine. Right? They would add strong tea or coffee to give it a little color. That would add flavor too, right? You were just making vodka, you gotta soften it up, so they would put cherry juice and prune juice. Sometimes they get real creative. These are real recipes, right? They would take the spittoons from the saloons, and they would put those in the fermenters, right? And they would add a little texture and flavor and stuff like that. So this was what's called compound whiskey. The folks in Kentucky and the surrounding states that were making what they were proud of, they called that straight whiskey. That was just straight whiskey, true whiskey, straight from the barrel. All the color came from the barrel, straight from the barrel, right? We don't really know exactly where that term came from, but you can imagine. Right? But that's what it was called. It didn't have a definition, but that's what they called it. So there's folks in Kentucky had a person in the United States government who was pretty important, and that gentleman's name was John Carlisle. And he was the Secretary of Treasury. And so what that means is all of his Treasury agents held keys to the distillery. So you see this bottle of larceny? Can you imagine holding that bottle of larceny up there? So John E. Fitzgerald was supposedly a Treasury agent, and that's shaped like a lock, and it has a keyhole in it. So that's why, because he was a Treasury agent, that's why it's shaped like a lock. It has keys on it. So he helped pass this law, and it's the first consumer protection legislation in the history of the United States. It's called the Bottle and Bond Act of 1897. And right there is a watershed moment. That is like, bang, this is what's making this really different now. Usually you don't want government in your life, right? You don't want it definitely in your business telling you certain things you have to do. We love it, right? Because it's a barrier to entry for people who just, anybody who wants to get in just can't be into the bourbon business because you gotta pass this criteria. So all of a sudden, there's this standard called bottle and bond. So March 3rd, 1897, it passes. You ever heard of when you go to the convenience store, you go to the gas station, you gas up, and you go in, you go, oh, a little snack for a little work, right? So you look at and you get, the honey buns are hard to pass up, right? So you look at the honey bun, you go, oh my God, that's gotta be good, right? So I know it's good, And then you look at the back and it has the ingredients and how many sugars in there. It's like 8,000 grams of sugar, right? 6,000 carbs in a honey bun, right? You might as well just jam it in your left ventricle, right? That's the safe labeling of food from the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. 9 years before that, we cared about the quality of our whiskey. So the Bottle and Bond Act comes out. On those cards that I passed out, and on my business card there, turn it over. On the back are the laws that make bottle and bond. They were a little bit different in 1897. It was actually a bonding period where you didn't have to pay taxes. Back then you had to pay tax immediately when the whiskey came off the still. We don't do that anymore because it's aging and we're losing an angel share every year, so we're not paying around for the angels anymore. We used to. But it was a way to put it into bond where you could, you only paid tax when you brought it out of bond. And the bonding period was of different lengths of time. Now the modern laws of bottle and bond state that it must be aged for a minimum of 4 years. So it's an age statement, bottle and bond. It's also strength. Whiskey can go into the bottle 80 proof or higher, but bottle and bond must be 100 proof every single time. That's why I get my tattoo says 100 proof, right? It's a bottle and bond tattoo. So 100 proofs. So right there, I'm guaranteed a good age and I'm guaranteed a good strength. I can't add prune juice or iodine or tobacco. I have to only add, by law, pure water. Ooh, there's a quality stamp right there. I can't add all these things. And it has to be exactly 100 proof, like I said. It has to be from one distiller, from one distilling season. That's almost like a vintage, if you will. You hear all these laws? Then you must put the real name of the distiller on the package and the individual number. Y'all are pretty familiar with tequila down here, right? So they have the NOM, the NOM on 100% pure agave, which tells you the exact plant that made it. Well, that's our version of it. So it's called the DSP. So on my arm here is DSP on our bottle and bonds. It has DSP, which stands for Distilled Spirits Plant. KY, because we're in Kentucky. If we were in Texas, it would say DSP TX. Right? And then our number is 1, because we're the best. Right? Just happens to be our number. Mr. Bernheim ran down and made sure he got number 1 after Prohibition. That's kind of cool, right? So this is Evan Williams, Bottle and Bond. This is exactly what people would be drinking in 1901. This is exactly what people would be drinking in 1915. 4-year-old, 100 proof, bottle and bond, traditional bourbon whiskey.
It was 100% corn,
Mhm.
almost 100% corn.
This is 78. Laws of bourbon state must be at least 51%. And this is 78, it's 12% malted barley and 10% rye. So when you taste this Evan Williams bottle and bond, dear, this is gonna be the one you're gonna taste in the back of your palate. You're gonna feel that spice all of a sudden, right there in the back of your palate. At the same exact time, you're gonna taste the vanilla, honey, and caramel in the front of your palate. This is bourbon, yes, sir.
Back then,
Mhm.
how did they control the proof of the whiskey at 100%, given the lack of technology?
They had hydrometers.
I'd have one.
They had hydrometers, and we still use those same hydrometers today. When we, they're the things that float, that has a mercury in the bottom of it and it floats. That's Dr. James Crowe started using that in 1938. He used sacrometers and hydrometers. Now, coming off the still is a different story. So how they controlled, they brought the proofs at a much lower proof. It was usually around 107 proof that they bring things off the still. We now have raised that because computers and technology has gotten to where we can control it by the minute. But back then people had to turn valves, right? And a lot of people, I don't know if y'all remember this, but a lot of people smoked back in the day, right? And so you go outside to have a smoke or you smoke inside, you say, oh shit, the still's still, we're coming off too high, right? Well, it's just like an electric stove, you just can't turn it down immediately. You can turn it down, but it's gonna come off the still at a higher proof for another couple hours. So that's why I think why they brought it off such a lower proof. But you're right, I mean, they couldn't really control it. I mean, they controlled as much as they could. And that's why there was a lot of inconsistent whiskey back then. Whiskey that they also might sell the government is some of that, what they call red line whiskey that got too hot. You're not gonna sell your good whiskey. You want to keep the good whiskey to sell to your customers. You can sell off your bad whiskey, right? Whether they call it red line whiskey back in the day. But you're right. But they could get it in the bottle pretty accurately. Absolutely. And the government was really over their shoulders. To make sure that they were over their shoulders, you know what the government did? Up until 1969, 1970, they had treasury agents that lived on the distilleries. So they were literally over your shoulder.
Have they always used multi-stage distillation? Like in Scotland, they use just a single stage copper stills.
Yes, so no. So we use pot stills just like they did back in the day, but when the coffee still comes out, and I think that's 1849 when the coffee still is invented, which is basically like the column still now. So I think it was until just before or after Prohibition that we started using the column stills, because we are making a different product than they are in Scotland. We're using the different. We want a consistency off the still, and so we started making a lot of whiskey. So the only way you can do that is with a column still.
Well, you can do that almost continuously, right?
Yes, and when you make it in a pot still, it's like making a new batch of tea every time. It's going to taste a little bit different. Of course, they're only using 1 grain over there, right? So it's a little better for them, but it's still different. Yes. Oh, I think okay.
Pure water, is that have to be distilled water? Is that what you're for?
Good question there too. That's these are all laws that need to be done. So what we all use now is called deionized water, or DI. And the way when Fred No explains that over at Jim Beam, I think it's the best. I love these guys. He got it from Booker, Booker No. Some of these guys were not scientists, not even educated as much as these people are, but they could tell it simply. Fred goes, you take water and you take everything out of it but the wet. That's deionized water. That would be pure water. So it's a way of filtering it, and then so as long as it's filtered and have all the chemicals. Of course, now we have fluoride and all that kind of stuff in it and all kind of things there. So that's what it is.
But don't some people use like spring water?
Well, spring water, sure, you can. I mean, pure water is pure water. I mean, you can use spring water, I'm sure.
So the reason I'm asking the question is I was just reading about Devil's, it's in Texas, and they bring the water from this pure source
Mhm.
in southwestern Texas. And
Yes.
They bring it here to Dallas, and that's what they cut their.
Yeah.
But
I can
what's
see
the
that.
point of doing that if you deionize it?
Well, deionizers cost about $100,000.
Well, I know what a deionizers
Yeah.
is, but then there's no characteristics of the water level. When you go.
But you don't want
deionized,
characteristics in the
it
water
takes
that
the
you're
low.
bringing it down to proof with, because you don't want to change the flavor of what you just aged it.
I guess
So
I
they use that when they're before.
They're using it in the before part,
When they're mixing.
is what it
So
sounds like to me.
Pure
when they're
water
trucking
can
it.
only be deionized water.
Yes.
By definition.
Yes, I would think so.
It's got anything else
Yeah.
in it. it's
So
not
so where the water source comes from doesn't make any difference.
Well, yes, it does, because you do need clean water to distill whiskey
So
with.
on the front end.
Yes, from the front end. Now, we're all using city water, to be totally honest and full transparency. We're not using lake water anymore. We all used to, but it's 2 million case brand. We're not using. There's not enough lakes to do that, and we're downtown Louisville. So we got the Ohio River. Do you want the Ohio River at the first run? No. So we're going to take city water, and then we're going to deionize it before we put it in. Yeah. And a lot of people like to dance around that. Oh, you only use this from the lake. You don't use it from the lake. You're using it from the Louisville Water Company. So, bottle and bond's a big deal. I like to talk to the different distillers from different craft houses around. You got some really good ones down here. I talked with Jess and Rob at Stranahan's, and John Foster over at Smooth Ambler, they got their hands more on the pulse of the craft world. They tell me there's probably 4,000 brands of American whiskey out there today. 4,000 brands. There's only 25 to 30 bottle and bonds in the world. That's how special bottle and bond is. Only about 25 or 30. Mhm. And really, here in Texas, in any state, you could probably only get 10 or 12. Because some of them are very regional. And even some that we make, like J.W. Dant, JTS Brown, T.W. Samuels, is the same whiskey as the Evan Williams bottle and bond. The Evan Williams bottle and bond is our national bottle and bond. And it's confusing to build 4 brands, right? We want to go with one name, so we want to use the #2 bourbon in the world to build that one, you know. And it'll never be a huge brand because the bottle and bond, you only use barrels filled in a 1 6-month period. So you're not talking about huge volume brands, which is why your Diageos of the world and these larger companies aren't going to be interested in bottle and bond because their job is to make money for their stockholders, and they're not going to screw around with a 70,000 case brand. But because we're family owned and we're family operated, the family really likes bottle and bonds and really want to make every style of American whiskey, including the recipes and the history of that. And they feel it's something that sets us apart is our style that other people aren't going to do or choose not to do. So we make 10 at Heaven Hill. And there's only 25 in the world. Pretty cool. And there's 4,000 whiskeys, so do the math. So these are good questions tonight. We're getting really good questions here. This is good. Enjoy this. Did you enjoy the whiskey so far?
Sure.
Yeah. So we're on to a good thing here. We got the Bottle and Bond Act going. But remember when I said that everybody was kind of hang around the saloons all the time because you're more likely to hang around the saloon because that's where you just hung around, right? You got a room in your house. You're not really going to sit around there. If you're out of work, they post jobs in the saloon. So you're going to go find work there. There might be a guy pop in. Hey, we need 5 guys to work today. You might get a job there. You had ceremonies there. You had different things happening in the saloon. People were drinking in saloons too much, right? So at the same time, we got this great Bottle and Bond Act. What's happening in the world too? The temperance movement and all that, right? So what happens on January 16th, 1920? Turn out the lights. The party's over. Prohibition, breaks out. So the 18th Amendment. It's time for all good things to end. Turn out the lights. The party's over. And for 14 long years, then we'll do it all over again. So, prohibition happens. You can't manufacture, sell, transport alcoholic beverages. You can't drink. There was no law against drinking. So people forget that. So you could, whatever you bought before. So rich people just bought liquor stores, right? And they bought things because they have money, right? So, but us poor saps, we had to figure other ways to do it. If you didn't have that much forethought, they allowed 5 companies to keep their licenses, and they couldn't manufacture, but they could sell the stocks that they had. And they borrowed stocks from other people because it just kind of sat there. So a lot of weird things happened during Prohibition in Kentucky. They said a lot of black sedans made its way down with Illinois license plates. Right? And they had the sheriff was guarding the rick houses, full of whiskey. Nobody could get in there, but the cars went back a lot heavier. Right? And they would just fill the barrels back up with water so that if anybody came and checked, it seemed like there was whiskey still in there. So a lot of things happening. The only way you could get legal whiskey was through a doctor's prescription. So 6 million prescriptions were written during Prohibition. And there was another way for rich people to because you had to pay the druggist and you had to pay the doctor. So you really get a pint, and it was bottle and bond too. So people did start to know that bottle and bond meant quality, and it was an assurance of many of that quality and assurance of good strength and a good age. But on December 5th, 1933, we get the 21st Amendment repeals the 18th Amendment, right? And this is a cool time. So in you're in the depths of the Depression. 25% unemployment. 1 out of 4 people are out of work. One of the big reasons we were in a depression is because all the tax money from the beer, wine, and liquor companies wasn't in the coffers. So when they started those back up, a lot of people went back to work in all the breweries and all the distilleries, and then the money started coming back in because people were buying the whiskey and there was heavy tax put on that kind of stuff. And so this started helping build the country back again because of all this. You had strange things happening because the people who knew how to make whiskey had been out of work for 14 years. So they had no money, like the Beam family. You know, Colonel Beam, Colonel Jim Beam, who reopened the Jim Beam plant. He had no money, so he had to go to Mr. Hummel and Mr. Bloom in Chicago, some businessmen that he knew and knew that. Actually, I think they contacted him and said, do you want to get back to work? We'll back you. Because he said, well, sure. Yeah. So in 3 months, he had that place back up and humming because he had a lot of good money behind him. That's why Jim Beam is based out of Chicago today, because that's where they were from. That's why it's a Chicago company, not a Kentucky company, right? Because that's where the money came from. Our family owned junior department stores in the state of Kentucky, so they were not affected by prohibition. They sold clothing. And even though it was depression, you still needed shoes, you still needed shirts. You know, they had a hard time, but they still did okay. So Harry and Joe Beam and a couple of investors come to them, and our family invested $17,500. And they bought the William Heaven Hill Farm. And that's why we're called Heaven Hill, because we bought the Heaven Hill Farm. It's all one word, Heaven Hill. And the reason we call it Heaven Hill is because as state capital, they were putting the license and somebody hit the space bar between heaven and hill by mistake. And they got the license. They said, oh, they called up. They said, this is wrong. Well, so we'll make another new one, but it's a $25 refiling fee. And the family goes, well, we're okay for a while. I mean, we just invested $17,500. You want 25? Well, it's like $300 today. So 25. And they go because they knew they were going to make bottle and bond whiskey, and they were going to have to age it for 4 years. So they had time to think about this. And over the time, Max, our president, he tells me that the family says, over the time they said, well, this sounds like a cool place. This sounds like a place, Heaven Hill. It sounds like a heavenly place. We're going to call it Heaven Hill. So it's kind of a cool thing that it happened by mistake like that. So it could have been a whole different company in that. So that's how we start, and that's how we got our name, and that's how we get our first whiskey. Comes out in I make our first barrel December 13th, 1935. And that's barrel serial number 1. That's how everybody does it. It's a big celebration. Everybody signs the barrel serial number 1. Then it comes out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're on 8.4 million right now from that day. So it's pretty cool. And we're the second largest producers of bourbon whiskey in the world. Jim Beam's larger than us, but Jim Beam is owned by a big multinational corporation out of Japan and have stockholders. And we're still owned by the same little family that own those little junior department stores and are still running the company today. It's pretty cool. We, like I said, Evan Williams, the Black Label alone, is the number 2 selling bourbon in the world. Goodness knows somebody's going to pass this up, and we're going to become number 3. And it's going to be just fine, because our goal is not to be the number 1 selling bourbon in the world or the number 2 selling. Our goal is to be the most admired and respected distiller of American whiskey.
Having fun doing it.
And have fun doing it. Now, we are in the bourbon business. We want to make money. You got to make money. But we seem to be. And we don't just make whiskey, but that's the heart and soul of the company, is the whiskey. So the same family owns the company today and still operates the company today. Max is a second-generation owner and the president of our company. He's 74 years old. His son and daughter are involved with the company and have major roles. And Kate's husband, Alan, is our chief operating officer. So it's really neat. It's a really fun company to work for. We all have our challenges. But like I said, our house style is a lot different than other folks. So because we're not owned by Wall Street and have stockholders to answer to, we can do things that our competitors either don't do or choose not to do. So we have major competitors. Diageo, the largest spirits company in the world, they make Bullet bourbon, right? That's fine bourbon, right? Brown-Forman, they make Jack Daniels, which is not a bourbon, but let's be honest, it's a competitor, okay? Crown Royal, another Diageo brand, that's a major competitor. It's not bourbon, but it's a major competitor. Jim Beam, number 1 selling bourbon in the world, it's a competitor, So how do we compete with them? How can we? How this little family from Bardstown can compete with them? Well, they got to get it in and get it out. You're already taking 4 years to age this stuff, right? So you got to wait, you know? So what we do, we wait a little longer, you know? Because they got to get it in and get it out. Well, let's wait. So our house style, I describe it as longer, stronger. So we keep it in the barrel a little bit longer than our main competitors across the line of our whole portfolio. And a lot of times people put it in as low proof as they can. So most of our competitors are 80 proof. Well, we don't start till 86. Our Evan Williams is 5 years old, 86 proof. And it plays against Jim Beam, Jack Daniels, Crown Royal, Bullet. They're all 4 years old, and Crown 3 years old. Ours is 5. Wow. Theirs is 80 proof, ours is 86. Bullet is 90, but we still got them on the age, right? They're all great whiskeys, but how do you stand apart, right? And that's what we do. Longer, stronger. Then because we didn't spend all those hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising, and we advertise a lot of our products, but not the way our competitors have to, we charge less. So longer, stronger, better value. So that's why some of our products aren't really respected as much, because we're like, how good can it be for $12? It can be really damn good. Because that Evan Williams Bottle and Bond, did you like it? That's great whiskey. How much is a bottle of that? On the back there on that shelf, it's like $12.83. Come on, that's crazy, right? But you'll never see one piece of advertising for Evan Williams Bottle and Bond. You go for Evan Williams, but not for Evan Williams Bottle and Bond, right?
Well, what's the difference? I mean,
The Black Label Extra Aged is 5 years old, 86 proof, and the Bottle and Bond is 4 years old, 100 proof. And that's specifically for people making cocktails. So your cocktail bars, or for you at home, if you like Manhattans, or want to make a cocktail with it instead of just drink it straight or whatever, that 100 proof is going to stand up in Manhattan much better than the 80 or 86 proof product. So if I start with an Evan Williams, which would be great, but I'm going to add vermouth to it on the rocks, and I'm going to stir up the ice in that, and that's going to water it down a little more. Well, that's going to make that spirit almost disappear in that cocktail. But if I start with 100, it's going to stand up.
Can you talk about the chemical reaction between ice and water and what the difference is? What about releasing the?
Well, all I know is when you put liquor on ice, it melts. That's about all I know. I really don't know. To be honest, I don't know the chemical reaction that really happens. I really don't. Anybody in here do?
Well, I was heard, if you drink neat, and then sometimes you say you put just like a drop of water.
Oh, I see what you're saying. It will open up the spirit, but I don't know the science behind that makes that happen. Is when you add it, it's gonna make the molecules probably larger when you do that, perhaps. I do know that a water molecule is 6 times smaller than an alcohol molecule, and so that's why the barrels at the top of a rick house will go up in proof, because the water will escape the barrel faster than a larger alcohol molecule. And it also probably, because that ice is cold, or depends on the temperature of the water that you put in it, probably has something to do with it too. But that would be a fascinating discussion, and people to ask, so I'll ask that of some of our scientists. Sorry I don't have an answer right now for that. Any other questions?
so even the second one, the yellow corn one, is it moderately priced as well? The entire
Yeah.
portfolio is moderately priced?
Yeah, there's not anything on the page here that's over $30. We don't have many things that's over $30 in our portfolio. How much is Henry McKenna here?
32, rounded up to 32.
So $32, and that was named #1 bourbon of the world this year. It's at the International Spirits Competition in San Francisco.
And it is awesome.
And it earns the degree, and that's $32. And when we
10
got
years.
that in May, we haven't raised the price, right? It's
10
got a
years.
little harder to find here and there because people have turned on to it. But that Elijah Craig that we're gonna taste here in a few minutes, how much is that Elijah Craig here?
I think it's 25.
That in that same competition, you know what we got #2. We got the #2 bourbon in the world with that.
Didn't
So
the
we won
barrel,
#1 and #2 bourbon in the world.
Barrel Proof just won.
In Barrel Proof last year, Elijah Craig won the best whiskey of the world.
Yes, sir.
Not just bourbon of the world, whiskey of the world by Whiskey Advocate magazine. And that's best whiskey. That's all whiskeys. So we make some damn good whiskeys, and as I always joke, nobody cares about awards till you win them. We've won a ton, right? So that Mellow Corn has won double gold in corn whiskey competitions. It has not won. This is the only bottle of bond straight corn whiskey in the world. What I'm really excited about is what's going on down here in Texas at Balcones. Balcones is a great little craft store down here in Texas, and they specialize in making corn whiskey. Because I think that when Chip started it, he's no longer there, but he had little problems with some of his investors, but he's now making whiskey in another place. But I think he saw that it's gonna be hard to compete with Brown Forman and Jim Beam and Heaven Hill and everybody, so I don't wanna make bourbon, nobody seems to be making corn whiskey, I'll do that. And it was a great choice, because corn whiskey, I think there's been articles written, is corn whiskey the next rye whiskey? You know, because bourbon whiskey is so hot, and now rye whiskey is such a big thing, but what's the next? Is it wheat whiskey? Is it corn whiskey? There's only a few things out there, so, you know, it could be. And we're poised and we're ready. We got Mellow Corn. Look, that bottle doesn't look very, I was in London last year for the Spirits Cocktail Week in London. And they love Mellow Corn over there, and they like making cocktails with it because it is 100 proof and it will stand up some cocktails, so they make cocktails with it. And a lot of places around here do too. But they said, and it's 45 British pounds for Mellow Corn over there. Okay? Wow. So there's a lot of import taxes on whiskey, and anything that goes to the UK that's 100 proof or higher has 10 British